everyone, it's Sister Elizabeth, and you are listening to In the Company of Charity, the podcast of the Daughters of Charity, and I am here with my co-host, Sister Liz Schoberg.
Hello, everyone. How's it going? February 2025.
I know, can you believe it? It's good to see you, Sister Liz. Good to hear your voice.
We are in it, man, and we are bringing some excellent content to you all today. And what we'll say this: if you have little ears around, you will want to listen to this episode on your earphones.
Yes.
Not in public, not on speaker. This is your warning. Explicit content awaits. And this is a very, very important theme that we are going to present to you today. And Lauren Sharmer, great therapist, counselor, who has a specialty in sexual addiction. And so she is going to talk a little bit about that. And it really is, you might say to yourself, what are the Daughters of Charity doing talking about sexual addiction and problematic sexual behaviors? And that would be a good question. But part of what we do is that no form of suffering would be foreign to us. And this is actually quite an important topic for young people these days. And I could go on, but Sister Elizabeth, anything that you want to add before we dive into the episode?
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. Like, why would we be doing this? This is a difficult topic. It's an uncomfortable topic. But I do think it's really, really important because I think sexual addiction obviously can really destroy a person's self, and can create just chaos and destruction in their lives and the lives of others around them. It can be harmful both to themselves and to others. So it's really, really important. It makes me sad that we live at a time when this is so aware and we have to talk about it. But at the same time, I think this is not new. It's not like it was just invented or just started to happen. This has been around for many, many years, and we didn't talk about it. We haven't talked about it for centuries. And because of that, there hasn't been the kind of therapeutic response that I think you'll hear from Lauren in this episode. I found her to be very open and honest and easy to hear what she had to say. And so I really, really encourage people to take the time to listen. And as Sister Liz says, you want to do this in a place that you can feel safe and feel comfortable. Maybe a couple of you want to listen to it together. But I think take it very seriously and do the work that you need to do for yourself as well.
Absolutely. We are not your doctor. We are not doctors medically. We are also not ordained priests. So, some of the things that are covered today might, if not for yourself, then maybe for someone else to support them in the process of healing, which that could be through, increase in the sacramental life. Counseling, maybe some treatment of some kind. So just as a disclaimer, we're not doctors and we're not your doctor, but I think a lot of this information will be very valuable to you, and to know that the church cares about this topic of pornography, sexual addiction, and healing. And there's some very good resources out there, one of which Lauren mentions of Fight the New Drug, and some of the things that are going on with Matt Fradd and others who are trying to be out there and help people move forward. So enjoy this episode. I'm sure you're going to learn a lot, and no doubt it will be helpful to you or to someone you love. Welcome to the podcast, everybody. This is Sister Liz, and I am absolutely delighted to have a friend and friend of the podcast on here today, Lauren Sharmer. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Hello, it's so good to be here.
Well, tell for the good of those listening who you are,
Yeah.
where you are, what you're up to.
Sure. So my name is Lauren Sharmer. I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in St. Louis, Missouri. I've done kind of a wide variety of things over the last decade after graduating college. I've been in St. Louis now for over 10 years, which is crazy. But I worked in youth ministry for several years, over 6 years with high schoolers, and ran a multi-parish youth ministry program. I, during that time, went back and got my master's in social work from the Catholic University of America, which is where I also have my undergrad from. And have done kind of a wide variety of things in the social work realm, working with the geriatric populations in both home health and hospice. And then in the last year or so, have gone full-time into my own private counseling practice that I have now here based out of St. Louis. And I also see clients in Florida because that's where my parents are. So that's it's been a winding journey. And in that, I went back and a couple years ago, did a year-long certificate program in treating sexual addiction through a Midwestern university. Just saw a need based on my experiences working with high schoolers and then just in the world to be able to do that, and wanted to kind of armor myself up to be able to provide as much support as possible. And in addition to one-on-one clinical work, have also had the opportunity to do some formation for area dioceses and religious communities, which has been awesome and has been a great gift to journey with a wide variety of people, lay, priests, religious individuals, and couples, just as they are working towards health and freedom and healing and wholeness, as we all are. So it's a real privilege to do it, and also a joy to be here to dive in a little bit deeper.
Yes. And part of, our hope with the podcast is to support young adults who are in that window of time where they're sort of making life decisions and moving in good directions, hopefully. And we know that a lot of people struggle, and this is in society, with various compulsive and addictive behaviors. It's, not just pornography and sexual addiction, but, in the areas of attachments to food, and areas of shopping or gambling. It's not even necessarily what we would say like clinically diagnosable levels, but just unhealthy relationships with these sorts of behaviors that then become patterns. And so that's sort of kind of where we wanted to start with. What is the state of affairs? What are young people facing these days? And, how can we move forward eventually with all this? But we got to know where we are right now.
Yeah. I think when you turn on the TV or fire up the computer or check Twitter or any of these things, it doesn't take long to see that the world is a pretty crazy place. And I heard it said once that in the absence of elders, we find our formation in the culture and in the world. So when we look at this question, who is forming me? What am I being formed by? Where am I being formed? I think there are a lot of people who, through no fault of their own, or maybe some fault of their own, or a mix of all those, we are surrounded by people, especially in that, in this kind of age range that we're talking about, who are finding their formation by the culture and by the world. And what is that formation looking like? It's telling them that their worth is in what they do and not who they are. It's telling them that the greatest goods that someone can achieve are beauty, money, and sex. It's telling them that it's not possible to be in healthy relationships, or that especially as we're being formed by the world, that's telling us all these things, that's telling us lies about who we are, where we are, who God is, what a man is, what a woman is. I mean, all of these things that are happening, people are trying to escape that in various ways, right? Like, we know the truth of the gospel, the truth of natural law, the truth of freedom and hope and healing is written in our hearts, right? We know that we are made for something more. And oftentimes there are things, whether it be addiction, anxiety, depression, trauma, any of these things that can kind of water down that truth or can make that hard to remember or to realize. But we know that we are created for something greater and for someone greater. And I think that most of us, or none of us, have escaped the reality of being formed by the world, right? And like I said, whether that's with, anxiety, depression, family origin stuff, compulsive behaviors in any which way, the reality is that we are being formed by the world around us, oftentimes more than by the truth of the gospel, the truth of the church, or any of those things. And so I think, like I said, to bring it back to the idea, what do you see when you go on the internet, or when you go in this like instant social media age, this instant gratification, this place where we get our worth from is from the world, or from what we think is going to make us happy in the world, which oftentimes leaves us feeling much emptier and much less satisfied.
It's been said by people holier and smarter than me about, what areas does the devil want to attack in order to get the most bang for the buck. And that really is attacking the family and sexuality, which is so intertwined with who we are. And I think we're coming to realize, I think at some point we all thought that pornography and sexual addiction was limited to, that's a man's problem. That's the guys have to deal with that. But, we've seen over time and through testimonies that this is a everybody problem. And that's sort of like your expertise. So say a little bit about like, what are the stats behind all of this, and what are some maybe misconceptions that we might already have that people need to know? Because this is, especially for people who are thinking about the seminary or about entering a religious community, everybody's got to answer those questions of like, what is your orientation? Like, what is your sexual experiences? Like, what is your experience as a male or as a female? How do we deal with all of that?
Yeah. So I think some of just like these facts, these fast facts, these stats, I'll just kind of go through them rapid fire, that most kids today are, and these are all from Fight the New Drug, which is an incredible organization that is doing a lot to combat, this pornographic age that we're living in. But so just some fast facts here. Most kids are exposed to pornography by the age of 13, with 84% of males and 57% of females ages 14 through 18 having viewed pornography. 1 out of every 8 porn titles shown to first-time users on porn site homepages describe acts of sexual violence, and at least 1 in 3 pornography videos show sexual violence or aggression. One study that kept track of couples over time found that consuming pornography was the second strongest predictor that a relationship would suffer. Of adolescents who have been exposed to pornography, 28% were first exposed by accident. 19% were unexpectedly shown pornography by someone else. 19% searched for it intentionally. Approximately, and this is according to a 2020 study, and so it's likely much higher now, approximately 91.5% of men and 60.2% of women report consuming pornography in the past month. And despite how unrealistic and toxic pornography can be, 1 in 4 young adults list pornography as the most helpful source to learn how to have sex. And 53% of boys and 39% of girls believe that pornography is a realistic depiction of sex. So just some of these stats here, you hear them, and and not only these stats, but the knowledge that a lot of people carry a smartphone in their pocket or have access to any number of devices. And within, I think, 8 seconds could be viewing pornography, or are 3 clicks away on a weird YouTube ad from consuming pornographic content, whether that's softcore, hardcore porn, whatever it is, that this is everywhere. And as we have learned more about how pornography affects the brain, how it affects relationships, then these porn companies and these individuals promoting this product, because it is a product, and it's a product that uses people, and it's a product that destroys lives. But they're trying to become cleverer, and they're trying to become more subtle about the ways that they are infiltrating the culture in the world. And so it is a lot of stark stats. And someone, you can hear this and we think, well, what are we supposed to do? And I think there can be so much easy despair when it comes to hearing these statistics. And I just think of the question of that Peter asks Jesus in the gospel, where else would we go? And that is the question for anyone listening. Like, we hear the stark realities of the ways that problematic sexual behavior and pornography is infiltrating our culture and our world, and it's infiltrated our bedrooms and our churches and our houses and our livelihoods and all of these things. And the reality for all of us is, where else shall we go? Where else would we go other than to Christ and to the words of freedom and healing and hope and forgiveness that are possible and that are found? And that's not a easy A to B journey, right? There's not, we hear this and we can know the truth of maybe what we want to do, or like I said, what we are created for, what we are made for. And then we're still going to fail, and we're still going to falter, and we're still going to struggle, and all of those things. But I think that it's important to know these statistics to be able to, because if you are an individual listening who has not been impacted by this, praise the Lord. And that is such a gift, that this is not your struggle, although undoubtedly, we all have our own struggles or our own compulsions or our own unhealthy behaviors or any of those things. But this reality is everywhere, and it's affecting, like I said, so many facets of life, and it's stunting psychosexual development. And like this, as I described, as the age of exposure to pornography gets younger and younger, we then have to become more diligent and just more aware of, like I said, the realities of what's out there.
And so, talk a little bit about, because I think science is telling us a lot, and we learn even more and more about how these things, yes, these are behavioral. So many are behavioral addictions, because, I get that dopamine hit, and then it sort of comes back. And now I've developed almost like a pathway. This is a pathway where it's always going to end. And then there's the shame that follows up afterwards. And, this helps us to understand. The more we understand about these things, then I can say, okay, now what? Because it's not like we just stop doing something. This is the wisdom of Alcoholics Anonymous. You don't just stop drinking. You have to replace that with connection, with community, with a purpose, with something more positive. It's not about like, oh, let's just do the harm reduction pathway where we just try to get people to do less. That's a great start. But we want to channel sort of those energies and grasp at those things in more healthy ways, which is not easy. And the statistics on relapse, so to speak, it's pretty high, and it's pretty likely that people are going to fall into these behaviors, in and out of them, before finally, quote unquote, being free. So, what are your thoughts on that?
I think, yeah, and just there is this really great phrase that we use in addiction recovery specifically, and I think people, and we can talk about more of the word addiction in a little bit, but because people hear it and they're like, well, I'm not addicted. We're so like, that is just one of those things that kind of instantly can cause people to just shut down. But this great kind of quote, visual reminder, 5 miles in, 5 miles out. What takes us 5 miles to get in takes us 5 miles to get out. Like, we have to go back, short of miraculous healing or short of some other cataclysmic event that can sometimes cause us to quote unquote heal quicker, which again, I would argue is that really a true healing anyway, that if we walk somewhere 5 miles in then we also have to walk 5 miles out, right? Like there's no other way. There's that quote, the only way through it is through it, right? And oftentimes, like when there are things that we don't want to do, the only way to do it, obviously, is to walk through it, even when we're resistant towards that. And so I think for a lot of people who just say, so to speak, the average individual who was exposed to pornography in middle school and has a history of engaging in compulsive behavior as maybe, let's say, like a tension reducing activity. And then, next thing they know, they're 35 and they're in a relationship or they're, have a successful job and relationship and career and family, any of those things. And they can't figure out why they're still engaging in this behavior. Well, it's because for the last 20 years, this was the thing that worked, right? This was, and I say worked as in total air quotes, right? That the reason why specifically pornography and masturbation, but other compulsive behavior is so effective is because it short circuits the brain and it provides instant gratification. Pornography and masturbation specifically short circuits our brain and provides instant gratification. And the more that we engage in this cycle, the faster it happens. And then the more we fall often. There's all sorts of things to be said about kind of cycles of the cycle of addiction, the cycle of acting out, whatever you want to call it. But Dr. Patrick Carnes, who is really by everyone's standard kind of the father of treating sexual addiction, right? He's a hero to many people in the field, but he has this quote where he says, "Addiction is a relationship, a pathological relationship in which obsession replaces people." So that addiction is a relationship, a pathological relationship in which obsession replaces people. And so I think for a lot of people, or for a lot of experiences, they would say, yeah, that this obsession that oftentimes comes about through no fault of one's own, especially we heard those stats on accidental exposures to pornography, it becomes the thing that can replace us from seeking authentic intimacy and community in other ways and in other places. And so when our brain is being short-circuited, our mind, because we of course know that we are created body, mind, and soul, our mind is telling our body and our soul that you're feeling sad, you're feeling frustrated, you're feeling triggered, you're feeling lonely, you're feeling forgotten, any of these things. You know what would work? You know what would make you feel better? If you were to engage in this behavior. And the more we've done it, the more our brain is so used to it that it becomes this total preoccupation. And it appears that there's no relief from the tension other than engaging in it. And this dopamine, like the way that dopamine, which is a chemical that the brain releases, which makes us feel good, a lot of times, most of the times, especially for people who are experiencing difficulties with compulsive, problematic sexual behavior, that dopamine is released as soon as we experience the arousal, oftentimes before we view the pornography, right? So the dopamine is no longer solely linked to the viewing of the pornography or the experience of masturbation. But that dopamine, it gets released to like the part of our brain that's responsible for emotion and learning. And then that makes us crave it even further. Then our adrenaline increases. Then we're in this hyper-aroused state. Then the brain releases oxytocin and vasopressin, which is the things in our brain responsible for creating these long-term memories. Then there are endorphins that are released. And then after the masturbation, there's serotonin levels that change. All of these things, these chemicals, these actual chemicals that are being released in our brains, which I think when people say, again, we're talking specifically about pornography and masturbation here, but this is also true of other compulsive behavior, like acting out, like you said, like overeating. If we're struggling with alcohol misuse, if we're addicted to drugs, or even on, a smaller but still effective level, our screens or social media, like why people, they're like, why? I just don't understand why I can't stop. Or why are these things so effective? Well, not only do you have an entire, history of this being something that quote unquote works, you have you have actual chemicals being released in your brain that are telling you this is going to make you feel good. This is going to be effective. This is going to make you stop feeling what you're feeling, which again is what makes it so effective for numbing out. And that's so it's the well-worn path, right? That we're most comfortable with. And I think we have to face the reality that for a lot of people, they are more comfortable with experiencing intimacy in the act of viewing pornography and masturbating than they are in intimacy in their own relationships. And I think that is what Dr. Carnes' point about, the addiction. It's where this behavior, that this obsession replaces other people in our life. Not because we want that to be the case, right? I can't tell you the amount of individuals I've spoken to who have said, I want to stop. Why can't I just stop, right? And that's that white knuckling. And I think that's, to kind of build the bridge here, especially with this conversation about the neural pathways, Sister Liz, is that, the world that we live in, and especially, us as people of faith, when we want to stop engaging in a behavior, specifically something that's problematic and sinful, we say, I'm just going to stop doing it. Today's the last day. This is the last drink I ever take, or the last cigarette I ever smoke, or the last time I ever view pornography, whatever it is. And then we try, what do? We try really, really, really hard to not do it, right? We sort of make a plan, but a shoddy plan. And God, we're not going to tell anybody about it because then people would know that we're struggling. And we white knuckle the behavior, right? And for days, weeks, months, I know people who've been able to white knuckle things for years. We're so obsessed. The obsession becomes not engaging in the behavior, right? Yeah. Which in and of itself is another cycle, right? And what we are trying to do here is to break the cycle and to replace those obsessions with authentic and real intimacy. And so I think that's the thing that is that we're so obsessed with white knuckling it, right? We love white knuckling it, but there's, we can white knuckle sobriety. We can white knuckle saying no, but we can't white knuckle recovery. And I think the question to ask for anyone that's listening or for anyone that's struggling is, we are so hell-bent on saying no to things as a cure-all. And really the question is, what are we saying yes to? And who are we saying yes to? And how are we saying yes? And how is what we believe about the gospel, or what we believe about our vocation, what we believe about relationships, enabling us and empowering us to say yes when for so long we've been told we just have to say no and it'll go away, which obviously has not and does not work.
It might be well to touch a little bit on some of those deeper challenges, beliefs, thought patterns, experiences from childhood, because sometimes these behaviors, unwanted behaviors, they stem from or they reinforce some of the things we already believe or have experienced. I know, when you and I were at Marygrove together, that Marygrove is a residential care facility for abused and neglected children. And so sadly, there were so many that had experienced sexual abuse and abuses of many kinds, which of course is a horrible, terrible scourge and sin that was inflicted on them. And so I think when we're struggling, it's easy to say, who can we blame? What can we, I want to assign it to something or someone, but in this healthier way of looking at something, how can we dig a little deeper and answer those questions? Because it's almost like Dr. Bob Schutz talks about the roots and the fruits. So you can cut off the fruits, but it's going to keep coming back. But when we get down to the root of things and the why, and maybe some more inner healing that has to happen based on things that we grew up with or were exposed to as children. What are your thoughts on that?
we all have our individual psychosexual stories, right? We all grew up in a house and in a family and in a community that shaped us for better or for worse. And it is true. There are some people, when I say that in the absence of elders, we're formed by the culture and the world, like that quote that I shared a little bit earlier. And I think for a lot of us, I hope it's the case, and this is I'm thankful that this is my story, that I grew up in a house with two loving parents who are still together and who showed my brother and I, who showed us what love is, and who I never doubted that I was loved, and I've always been cared for, and I've always been provided for. I've always felt very safe. And so if that is a lot of our stories, and it still doesn't mean that we have a perfect life, right? But each of us have our own individual stories and our own psychosexual experiences. And the way that we were taught about or exposed to sex growing up is something that stays with us and forms us for the rest of our lives. And those early experiences, be it with a partner, be it with an experience of pornography and masturbation, that becomes like our earliest foundation, right? That becomes kind of like the bedrock of what we build everything else on in our own psychosexual stories. And oftentimes becomes like our lowest common denominator in terms of acting out or our behaviors when we are triggered and when we are struggling. And so if that lowest common denominator is a healthy, safe, cared for environment, you will respond differently to a situation than someone where that was not the case. And a lot of times that kind of base knowledge, like I said, it's that thing that we fall back when we experience temptation, when we have a traumatic event, when we feel dysregulated. And I think it's a thing I say to clients a lot is that, what would it look like to draw a line between your current struggles and your early experiences? So our unique, like sexual and emotional learning experiences, our unique exposures to pornography, masturbation, sex, any of these things. And what we want to do, Sister Liz, is we want to manage and make excuses for our past experiences, because then we can put it in a box and put it on a shelf and never have to deal with it again, right? And then 15 years down the line, when we're engaging in behavior that we thought we had taken care of a long time ago, we're so surprised that it's still affecting us. And that's really because we placed those things in that box on the shelf because we tried to manage and excuse the behavior. And this happens a lot in the church. And in that question of what are you saying yes to, what are you saying no to, that's where I think that question becomes really important. And there is a difference between getting to the root of our own sexual brokenness, which is important, and like merely managing it. And I think, to dive in a little bit further, that, those first exposures to curiosity about the world, how was not just sex, but about the world and relationships, how was your curiosity met? Was it met with delight? Was it met with someone answering your questions, or were you shamed for it? Or were you told, you shouldn't be curious about these things? So then the next time you are curious about something, instead of asking for help, instead of keeping it in the light, you are being quiet about it, and you're being hidden about it, and you're being tricky about it. All of these things that, so how was curiosity met? And really, like, that all goes back to, were we feeling safe? And especially if there was like that lack of experience of safety growing up, I think that can really impact us. And that's kind of, I think, what you were alluding to earlier, when sharing about our experience in Married Girl, for sure. I think also asking ourselves the question, like, how did people around you, or how were you taught to deal with anger, frustration, loneliness, lack of control? Again, was that met with gentleness? Was that met with curiosity? Was that met with understanding? That our brains, the like science between how the brains work and develop is crazy, but especially males' brains are not fully developed until 25. And so there's so many things that are happening in these.
When I was in college, I liked to remind them of that.
Yeah.
brain is not fully developed yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then these things impact us, and they're woven into not only the fabric of our lives, but actually the way that our brain develops. And there is something that I want to pay specific attention to, which is the 4 attachment styles. So this is like a whole other podcast, and maybe we can do that down the road. But the 4 attachment styles are based on, they are secure, avoidant, anxious, and anxious avoidant, or disorganized, which is the 4th. But really, kind of the 30,000 foot view of attachment styles is that the way that we were, the relationship that we had with our earliest and primary caregiver then becomes the way that we relate to the rest of the world. And as we were talking earlier, sister, is also the way that we relate to God oftentimes. And so, those attachment styles are so crucial to know. So if you had a relationship with your parents, with your primary caregivers, where you felt safe, where you were cared for, where you were told, I love you, then likely you're going to have a secure attachment. Your needs were met. You were acknowledged, you were heard, any of these things. If there was an experience where your needs were not met, or where you would ask a question and your parents were too busy and they weren't there, or maybe you spent a lot of time alone as a child, or any of these things, that can be can lead to a more avoidant attachment style, where you don't want to get close to anyone, or when there is that anxious attachment style where sometimes they were there and sometimes they weren't. You kind of never really knew what was going on. You never really knew up from down. And so then now when you're forming relationships, sometimes you're hot and sometimes you're cold, right? Like sometimes you want to be in it and sometimes you want to be out of it. And then that disorganized, that anxious avoidant attachment, the 4th is kind of a mix of those last 2. But with respect to like our unique psychosexual development and our attachment style, that is another one of those things that can kind of help us learn that lowest common denominator, that can help us learn, why it is that we respond and behave the way that we do in response to things. And I think in addition to, or kind of a jumping off of that attachment styles, is how securely or insecurely someone is attached is a great indicator of how and why they are engaging in problematic sexual behavior. So attachment is super, super important. And I think the good news is that what is broken in relationships is healed in relationships. And so, yes, there may be tendencies, like as we grow older and as we're adults, or as we enter into relationships with other individuals, with communities, with our dioceses, whatever it is, that, there can be this kind of despair, like, oh, well, I have this anxious attachment style, and so I can't get close to anyone. No, the good news is, like, when we form healthy relationships as integrated people who are not defined by our past experiences, then we are able to kind of heal some of those attachment wounds, right? And some of those difficulties from our earlier experiences. And so I think that is very important for people to hear, that what is hurt in relationship is also healed in relationship. And that's especially true with the attachment styles.
I think it's really important that we touch on the faith aspect and as Catholics who are trying to live authentically and to follow Jesus, there may be sort of additional complexity in one sense of trying to heal, and as it relates to guilt, as it relates to shame, and seeing the Father, in his approval or disapproval, or, that attachment style that you mentioned earlier can be placed on God as Father. And so I think, people will sometimes say like, oh, guilt is bad. Like we don't want to feel bad. Well, sometimes guilt is good. That drives us to repentance. It marks that we need to make a change, but then it can overflow into this sense of, I am bad, I am not a good person, I'm a sinner not worthy of repentance or healing. God clearly doesn't love me if he doesn't want to help me with this challenge, whether that's sexual addiction or anything else, any other sin or unhealthy behavior that we might engage in.
Mm-hmm.
So where's the hope in all of that?
The hope in it, Sister Liz, is that God is not defined by it. God has one attachment style, so to speak, and it is free and secure and loving and caring and careful and kind and merciful. I mean, any of these things, like, that is ultimately what we are created to receive. And so our own messy human experiences and our flawed family of origin and our flawed histories and our flawed, any of these things, they do not define God, and he does not define us by them. And so I think that is why, as I said earlier, anything we are sharing is a tool for us to kind of put in our tool belt to know, oh, that, like, a tool to put in our tool belt to reveal to us more why we are the way we are, why we are engaging and acting in behaviors that we do. And then how is that showing us what we are ultimately made for and where we are falling short?
I think everybody has to go through the process of self-knowledge. I mean, all of us have had, even if it's as simple as addiction to this little square box that we carry around called a phone, like, everybody's got to put things in the proper place of virtue in life. And going from one extreme to the other, sometimes for some people, it's more isolation and they need to get out of themselves and reach out and engage. And then for others, it's I'm a highly extroverted person, so I could be doing something different every night, hanging out with people and just filling my time to the brim with things. And so my tendency would require me to try and do some more silence and spend some more time alone and pray and things like that. And so I think sometimes we might see our sins or behaviors as only bad and only something to be resolved and just terrible all around. And I think, as we're starting to think about what's the path forward and where's the hope, the idea that we have a God that's so good that he can even use our sin or our brokenness for his glory, which is just kind of mind-blowing, because I think we're as Catholics, we can get into the idea that to be a saint, I have to be completely free of everything that is bad, hurtful, and that we should just never sin. And it's an unrealistic, scrupulous attitude to have, because we are going to sin. We are going to mess up. We're going to make poor choices. And the fact that God is so good that he can even use that for his glory, and these times that we fail, to continually run back to him. Because I tell you what, like, if I was not a broken person or in need of a savior, I probably wouldn't pray. I probably wouldn't go to confession regularly. I probably wouldn't rely so much on the Mass as the bread of life, and the Eucharist as something that's like food for my journey that I can't do without, if I didn't have some areas of brokenness that are in need of healing. And I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's so true, Sister Liz. And I think that, one thing I often remind individuals, both in counseling and just in conversation, is we are so quick to define ourselves and define other people by their behaviors and by, and and by, these, especially when we can see like an obvious unhealthy behavior, whatever, it becomes this thing that we fear defines us. And I think, and one thing I say a lot when my formation work is I tell individuals, like when we're taking stock of our past and our experiences and our unique stories, like there is nothing in your past that you think defines you that could disqualify you that disqualifies us from the call of abundance that is written over our lives. But there are things that could destroy us if they're not brought to the light and if they're not shown their proper reverence and they're given really the attention that they deserve. And so I think there's nothing that disqualifies us, but there are things that could destroy us. And what we have is a kind God who says what? Come to me, all you who are labor and are heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. But the problem is, instead of heeding that invitation, we are instead going for the places, the quick fix of intimacy, the quick fix of dopamine and these releases, that we described earlier, these chemical responses that are happening in our brain, because it appears to be more reliable than whatever the Lord is going to give us or not give us. And I think that's the thing to be reminded, is that when we're talking about like the long haul of healing and growth and freedom, but also just growth in Christian formation and discipleship, the question, a question to ask is, what are my experiences and how do those experiences impact my expectations? So my expectations of God, my expectations of myself, my expectations of other people. So that how do my experiences inform my expectations? And then also how can those expectations positively impact our own experiences as well moving forward? And really if I had to just like hammer it down to one thing, the question of how to, disengage in unhealthy coping mechanisms, the questions of how to stop in these compulsive behaviors, is the question of, where are we finding and believing our intimacy to come from? And the issue, Sister Liz, is that most people, based on those statistics, the fastest and most consistent intimacy, and it's a false intimacy, but an intimacy nonetheless, that they have experienced is through problematic sexual behaviors, is through pornography, masturbation, is through fantasy thinking, is through disengaging. Like, it appears that is the thing that causes us to have the greatest amount of intimacy. And really, that it's just because it's a much smaller cup to fill, right? Because it's the same thing over and over and over again in that cyclical behavior. But, the question to ask ourselves is, where do I believe that the intimacy I am made for is going to be found? And yes, 100% first found in our relationship with the Lord, which, like you said, Sister Liz, is a much slower grind, right? Than just even these kind of quick fixes that we can find. Like, there are quick fixes of fake intimacy everywhere. But those are not ultimately going to ever satisfy us or make us feel complete or free or healthy or any of those things that we really desire to be and that we're created to be. And so I think that's the, examining our experiences and expectations around intimacy, I think is really important. And then, we're not just talking about like sexual intimacy between partners, and we're not just talking about, as like sexual intimacy in between two people is not the antidote to looking at pornography and masturbation, because there are plenty of people who are having sex and are still engaging in problematic behaviors, right? Like that's, but it's realizing that there's a much deeper intimacy that we're created for. And I think too, part of moving forward necessitates like not just a reckoning, Sister Liz, like a reconciliation with the things that have happened in our past and where we want to be now. And for a lot of people listening, their first exposures to pornography and masturbation, or their first exposures to other unhealthy behaviors, were not their fault. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they viewed something at a difficult point in their day, week, or life, and they experienced something that they've never experienced. And then all of those chemicals in their brain started getting released. And then next thing they knew, they're 15 years into this compulsive behavior. Or for a lot of people listening, they never experienced intimacy in their own home with their parents or between their parents. And so then where did they look to find it? On a screen, right? Or there are people listening who, heard the sounds of their parents yelling at them or each other every day, and they just wanted to escape and they just wanted to numb out. And so what could they do? They could engage in this behavior. Or there are people who have experienced, profound trauma in their life, and especially whether it's, sexual abuse or another trauma of that sort. And so in a very complicated way, like their experience of shame and that cycle is interlinked with this trauma narrative that is just being replayed out every single time that we use. And so to have the compassion, I think, for anyone's younger self who didn't have these experiences, and compassion for our current self who has carried this burden for a long time. And I think self-compassion is seen as weakness, or it's seen as excusing behavior, which I guess it can be taken to its absolute extreme. But I think, Sister Liz, what it can do is what you just said. Like, it can reveal to us our own need for God and our own desire for something more, which is real and authentic intimacy.
If there's any good news that's out there, I mean, the prolific nature of what's available online, there are far more resources now for getting help and for healing and for bringing hope than there were even 10, 15 years ago. And so the fact that some of these things have been brought into the light is, I think, the first step in really, really moving forward and fighting this battle, which is everyone's to fight in some sense. Everyone has been affected in some way, by addictions, by these messages from society and from the culture. And so to be able to say there is help available, and it's free a lot of times. Maybe there's times where people do need to seek out counseling in addition to being engaged in the faith and sacraments. But praise God that there are many, many resources available out there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think those resources that are out there, Sister Liz, are given with the caveat that you are not supposed to do this by yourself. That doesn't mean if you're struggling with something, you need to, tomorrow go and tell every single person you meet the thing that you're struggling with. Like, that's not prudent either, obviously. But I think that there is something to be said if you are experiencing compulsive behavior or struggles with, is to find 3 to 5 trusted people that you can say something along the lines of, I have a desire to grow from this experience, to stop engaging in these behaviors. And would you be a part of that journey with me? And I think telling someone doesn't mean that you then have to tell them everything again for the rest of your life. Like, we live in this all or nothing mindset, kind of like what you said earlier, Sister Liz. Like, either it's entirely good or it's entirely bad. And so I think telling people doesn't mean like telling everyone all the time our deepest, darkest secrets, but it's inviting light in. It's letting light into these places that have lived in the darkness for a long time. And so I would always say that's always the first thing that I would say to someone is to invite somebody else into this part of the story, because then you are actively like living in the truth that, 1, you're not supposed to do this by yourself, and 2, that you are not defined by this thing. And I think for a lot of people, like, the fastest way we can be reminded that we're not defined by our sin or by our struggles is to tell someone else about them and to still be loved anyway. And so, like, may we be the type of friends to other people that when we hear hard news, remind them, like, thank you for telling me, I still love you and I still respect you. And so I think that's a really crucial thing, is to bring these things to the light more, and to not only talk about them more in a way to lower the stigma, or, like I said, just make these conversations more available, but really to just like actively practice the presence of being known, not just in our strengths, but in our weaknesses. So I think that would be the first thing I would say, is to tell somebody else, and to have that not just be in the sacrament, in the sacrament of reconciliation. Again, reconciliation is a very good thing, but there's a lot more to the story, especially, one 15-minute confession is not going to erase 15 years of compulsive behavior. Like, it's just not how it works. The next thing I would say would be to start looking at like your rituals surrounding the acting out, and just recognizing rituals. There's great, and maybe Sister Liz, we can put some of these, there's maybe 3 or 4 YouTube things that I would really recommend that people listen to. But again, even though there are so many good free resources and all those things out there, none of these are a replacement for authentic community. None of these are a replacement for the work of spiritual direction or counseling or any of those things. So, but Father Sean Kilcawley, who's a real hero and mentor of mine, has a couple of very helpful practical things just on recognizing rituals and these things that surround these behaviors. And then ultimately we fail without a plan, right? So creating some sort of sobriety plan, whatever you want to call it, and whatever that looks like is going to be different for individuals, whether that is something that needs individual counseling, or that could benefit from support from a group, or that could benefit from support from a trusted friend. But, creating that plan allows us to have accountability for connecting, our experiences and our expectations and our behaviors. Just another kind of practical thing is that for a lot of people, putting some sort of filtering on their devices is a very good first step. It's not a cure-all. None of these things are a cure-all, as I've said, but I think it can help us recognize maybe where our weaknesses are, or where, just like those places that are more of a struggle for us and can kind of be a good first line of defense. But in addition to, having filtering software on our phones and, accountability plans that way, a lot of it is kind of detoxing from the toxicity of having devices around us all the time. And so, something I would say to anyone, not just someone engaging in problematic behaviors, is don't sleep with your phone by your bed. It's not good for anyone. Like, I sleep with my phone in the kitchen, and I have an alarm clock, this crazy invention that's a little box that has buttons you press and it wakes you up in the morning. And so I think that's a really good, because again, if the first thing you are doing and when you wake up is looking at your phone, and if the last thing you're doing before you go to bed is looking at your phone, that is telling me that you are seeking intimacy in that screen and not in God or other people. And so I think that having some boundaries around our phone, and that's also just good, like healthy standards for when we're with other people. Like, I go to my friends' houses and I usually try to leave my phone in the car, because I don't want to be on my phone when I'm with real people. And the fastest way to make me shut down in a conversation is to pull out your phone as I'm talking and start looking at your phone. It's so ridiculous. And so I think even just part of that is we have all this fear, like, well, if I don't have my phone, how are people going to get a hold of me? Like, or if I don't have my, if I don't have access to social media or any of these things, then how are people going to know what's going on? And I tell you what, I've not posted on social media in months. And so, yeah, some people don't know what's going on in my life. And also that's okay, because you know what they could do? They could call me and ask me, right? Like, I'm trying, like, how is just, this invitation to live in reality is ultimately the great invitation of the Christian life. And I think it's also important to realize that there are a lot of things that are causing us to not live in reality. And so I think what is true is that one of a way to expedite healing and freedom and growth and all of these things is to constantly strive to seek to live in reality. And our phones can connect us to other people, and our, social media can be used for connection, and that's really great. But when it becomes the place that we're experiencing intimacy, then that's where we can really start to have difficulties. And so those would just be some kind of like practical things that I would say can help in the journey towards health and healing.
I have one last question for you. When are you going to start your own podcast?
Never.
It's fine. You could just keep coming back on ours.
No, it's
Lauren Sharmer, thank you. Really?
Yeah, no, you are so welcome. It's such a gift to be. And like I said, we'll make sure to I'll put some of those resources out for people to be able to see for themselves.
Excellent. All right. Well, for everybody listening, we're praying for you. You know how to reach out to us, and